This is not okay. This needs to stop now. This is cancer.
A lot of MMA fans online have been posting about how disappointed they are with UFC 300. I'd have to agree with this take. Yes, it would be a good pay-per-view normally, but so far it is not that once-in-a-decade card material that UFC 300 should be. Yes, I know not every fight has been announced, but remember, once every fight is announced, that will be the best-case scenario. Injuries and other things result in a few fights falling off of every single UFC card, and UFC 300 will be no different. Which means I don't think right now is a bad time to compare 299 and 300. With that, a lot of people are actually saying UFC 299 looks better than UFC 300 so far. For reference, pause if you need, but here are the current lineups for each card as of January 24th. UFC 299, UFC 300. So comment down below, does UFC 299 look better than UFC 300 to you? I personally think the cards are razor close, but I think 299 does edge out 300 ever so slightly. UFC 300 probably is the bigger names overall. Justin Gaethje, Jiří Procházka, Aljamain Sterling, and effectively Charles Oliveira all headline pay-per-views in their last fights. Since let's be honest, we all know Amanda Nunes was not the main event to that Vancouver card, it was Charles Oliveira. But the issue is there is simply a lot of bad matchups compared to UFC 299. For example, they're taking Jiří Procházka, arguably top 5 most exciting fighter in the UFC, and placing him against Alexander Ratchets, whose specialty is boring fights. It might not just be style mismatches, but also level mismatches. Cody Garbrandt and Deiveson Figueiredo are big names and both entertaining on their own, but this is not a competitive fight at all. As soon as Figgy lands once on Cody's glass chin, Cody is going to be sleeping. Compare that to UFC 299, Dustin Poirier versus Benoît St. Denis. Both very exciting fighters, but likely not a total level mismatch like the previously mentioned fight is, so it'll likely be an absolute war and a fairly competitive one. I wouldn't be surprised if the UFC is more focused on getting big names on 300 than actually making great matchups, because that is unfortunately what the matchmakers seem to be doing right now. The decision making so far has been an absolute mess for 300. Why not do a women's super fight between Zhang Weili and Alexa Grasso on UFC 300? Instead, they're doing the China versus China title fight featuring Zhang Weili on UFC 300. Why not do the China versus China title fight for the fight night in China and do the women's super fight on the UFC 300 super card? Why would the UFC waste their opportunity like that by doing the China versus China title fight in Las Vegas at UFC 300 instead of in China? I don't know, but we can keep going. Why not do a grapple-heavy match between Brian Ortega and Aljamain Sterling and have Calvin Kattar and Yair Rodriguez do a war instead of the current setup of 2 grappler versus 2 striker matchups? Since I just think Aljamain Sterling, being a former bantamweight champion and arguably being the second or greatest bantamweight of all time, probably deserves a little bit higher ranked of someone than Calvin Kattar. But either way, right, I think those 2 fights, Calvin Kattar versus Yair Rodriguez and Brian Ortega versus Aljamain Sterling, are better than what currently exists with Ortega versus Yair and Kattar versus Aljo. Yes, I know Ortega versus Yair is not on 300, but they were announced about the same time, so they could have swapped out the opponents and made better fights. But I could go through every fight on 299 and explain why it's a great matchup. I could go through every fight on 300 and explain why there's a lot of bad matchups, but that'll take all day. Now, why is UFC 299 being stacked so heavily? Shouldn't some of these banger fights from 299 maybe be pushed back to make UFC 300 more special? Well, I think the first factor is the one my thumbnail pointed to. The UFC really wants to push Sean O'Malley as a star. It seems he is the UFC's first test at a groomed company man star, so they're trying to see if their experiment will work. Because Sean O'Malley lacks any personality and ability to hype up a fight himself, Dana has to stack the card beneath him. This way, when the card does big numbers, the UFC can point to O'Malley's star power. But what does the UFC gain from pretending O'Malley is a bigger star than he really is? Well, nothing for now, but by having him headline a stacked card, it'll help get more eyes on him, growing his fame more, especially if he can have an entertaining fight with Chito Vera, and win, obviously. Which for the UFC would then ideally give O'Malley the ability to headline and still sell weaker cards, since that's something a real star like Sean Strickland is capable of doing, as we saw with UFC 297, which was in both name value on paper and, actually watching it, an abysmal card, but still broke the record gate for a Canadian sporting event, pretty much entirely due to Sean Strickland. I guess we just have to hope this backfires and Chito embarrasses O'Malley badly enough that it relegates him back to his chair in the corner of the bedroom, where he likes to be. The second factor is that Francis Ngannou is also having a boxing match the same day as UFC 299. Following the Tyson Fury fight, Dana White likely realized he messed up by letting Ngannou go and that Ngannou has real star potential. Now he's doing what he can to try and drown out the hype for Ngannou's next fight. That way, people don't realize that he was wrong. People will be giving a lot less attention to Anthony Joshua versus Francis Ngannou if the UFC card that's going on later that day is so crazy and has tons of stars on it. Well, yes, it'll be possible to watch both since they aren't going on at the same time to the boxing match in Saudi Arabia. I know I'll be watching both. The issue is the discussion afterwards. Fury versus Ngannou took place during an off week for the UFC, so it garnered a ton more attention, right? The entire week before and week after, everyone was just talking about Francis Ngannou versus Tyson Fury. No one was really talking about UFC because guess what? There was no UFC happening at the same time. It's tough to say how Ngannou's next boxing match is going to fare and, be as hype as the Fury Ngannou match, especially, in all media hype and post-fight hype compared to a super stacked UFC card. Is everyone just going to be talking about that UFC card instead and ignoring Ngannou? And of course, the more successful Ngannou is, the more likely it is other UFC stars break from the promotion to do their own thing. The UFC, of course, wants to prevent that from being the case, so naturally they're doing what they can to dominate the hype cycle of the Francis card. That way it's less successful, so less UFC fighters try to chase the bag outside of the UFC. Now, both of these could be seen as kind of malicious reasons, especially the second. I don't think this third factor is, though. The third factor is that by stacking UFC 299, it leaves some great fights to potentially be pushed back for UFC 300. That could be on purpose. Let's say BSD gets a minor injury, well now Poirier versus BSD has to be pushed back. Well, now it's another great fight for UFC 300, but it could also be on purpose. Oh, 300 isn't as good as it should be? Poirier, BSD, we're gonna need you guys on that 300 card. But if Charles versus Arman Tsarukyan has to be pushed back, which I think is one of the actual good matchups on UFC 300, well, guess what? UFC 300 now uses a massive fight, especially, if one of them is out and the UFC instead tries to get someone coming in on short notice rather than just push the fight back, well, that's still going to be a weaker UFC 300 card due to the short notice fight, likely being a much weaker fight. And I think this is actually pretty smart because as we know, UFC 200 ran into this issue. The card was supposed to be a lot better than it ended up being, but so many fights fell through. You had two headliners fall through, and the UFC struggled to get replacements for either of those that could live up to it. For those who don't know, UFC 200 was supposed to be headlined by Diaz versus McGregor 2. Then it was supposed to be headlined by Jones versus Cormier 2, and both those fights fell through. Since, as we know, our boy Steroids Bones Jones was obviously a little bit busy doing just that. That forced the UFC to get Brock Lesnar out of retirement, who I guess was also roided up. Brock Lesnar had to come save the card and have Amanda Nunes, of all people, headline the card because you kind of have to have the champion headlining, even if Brock Lesnar was the name that was selling the card at that point. It's fair to say the UFC higher-ups have thought about that fiasco and want to leave 299 as a good buffer to potentially help save 300 if things get dire. Plus, I think 299 being a crazy card would actually help build hype for UFC 300. If 299 is a banger card, all those promos for UFC 300 are going to be even more effective. Though I guess the UFC is also hosting a bunch of trash Apex cards in between. I guess that'll effectively stall the hype in its tracks, but maybe that's why you should watch my video on why the UFC needs to stop using the Apex in 2024. Comment down below what you think about all this. I'd love to hear it. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.